April 18th, 1943, 7:25 in the morning. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. First Lieutenant Rex Barber checked his oxygen mask one last time, the Pacific sun already beating down on the metal skin of his P-38 Lightning. The roar of 18 twin-engine fighters filled the humid air. Sweat ran down his neck. His hands were steady on the controls. In exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes, if everything went perfectly, he would be hunting the most wanted man in the Pacific. The mission was simple to state, impossible to execute. Fly 435 miles over open ocean. Find 2 bombers in the vast sky. Kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man America wanted dead more than any other. Barber had been flying combat missions for months now, downing Japanese bombers and Zeros in the vicious air battles over the Solomon Islands. But this was different. This mission had come down from the highest levels. President Roosevelt himself had approved it. The intelligence was precise, too precise to ignore. American codebreakers had intercepted a Japanese naval message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour. The Admiral would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on a tight schedule. He was known for his punctuality. That habit might kill him. The P-38. Lightnings lined up on the crushed coral runway were unlike anything else in the Pacific theater. They looked alien. 2 long booms extended back from the wings, each housing a massive Allison V1710 engine producing 1,150 horsepower. Between them sat the central nacelle, where the pilot controlled this machine of war. Twin tail fins rose from the booms, giving the aircraft its distinctive silhouette. To the Germans in North Africa, it was the Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. To Japanese pilots, it was simply terrifying. Major John Mitchell sat in the lead aircraft, reviewing his calculations one more time. The math had to be perfect. Any mistake in navigation, and they would miss the intercept entirely. The flight plan called for 5 legs across empty ocean, flying at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar. Radio silence would be absolute. There would be no second chances. Mitchell figured the odds at 1,000 to 1, but those were the best odds they were going to get. The P-38 had been designed in 1937 when Lockheed, then a small aircraft company, responded to an Army Air Corps specification that seemed almost impossible. The military wanted a fighter that could fly 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, reach that altitude in 6 minutes, and operate at full power for an hour. They wanted range. They wanted firepower. They wanted everything. Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, just 27 years old, delivered something revolutionary. The twin-boom design solved multiple problems at once. Mounting the engines and the booms freed up the central nacelle entirely for armament. No need to synchronize guns to fire through propeller arcs. No need to compromise. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon could be mounted in the nose, all firing directly forward. When a P-38 pilot pulled the trigger, he unleashed a devastating concentration of firepower. The combined weight of fire exceeded 500 rounds per minute. Targets didn't just get hit, they disintegrated. The twin-engine configuration provided something else crucial for the Pacific War. Redundancy. If one engine was damaged, the pilot could limp home on the other. Single-engine fighters had no such luxury. Over the vast distances of the Pacific, where emergency landing sites were non-existent and rescue unlikely, that second engine meant survival. P-38 pilots knew their aircraft would bring them home. Usually. By 1943, the P-38G model had been refined through hard combat experience. Each boom housed not just an engine, but also a turbocharger, giving the Lightning impressive high-altitude performance. The cockpit was spacious compared to cramped single-engine fighters. The pilot had excellent visibility in all directions except directly behind. The control yoke was a wheel, not a stick, which took some getting used to. But pilots who mastered the P-38 loved it. The aircraft could outrun almost anything in a dive. It could climb like a rocket. It packed the firepower of a light bomber. The morning briefing had been brief, but intense. Admiral Mark Mitcher had personally selected the pilots. 18 P-38s would make the flight, 16 for the actual mission, 2 as spares. 4 planes were designated as the killer flight. Their job was to intercept and destroy the Japanese bombers. The other 14 would fly top cover, dealing with the expected Zero fighter escort. Everyone understood the stakes. If they succeeded, they would eliminate Japan's greatest naval commander. If they failed, the mission would likely remain classified forever. Either way, nobody could talk about it afterward. Captain Thomas Lanphier led the killer flight. Barber was his wingman. Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Lieutenant Raymond Hine rounded out the attack element. Major Mitchell would lead the entire formation, navigating across 435 miles of ocean, using only compass headings, airspeed calculations, and precise timing. There would be no landmarks, no navigation aids, just open water and Mitchell's ability to dead reckon their position. If he made an error of even a few degrees, they would arrive at empty ocean. Yamamoto would land safely. The mission would fail. The engines coughed to life one by one. The sound was distinct. The Allison engines had a particular growl, deeper than single-engine fighters. Twin propellers on each aircraft, spinning in opposite directions to cancel out torque effects. The engineering was sophisticated. The maintenance was constant. But when everything worked correctly, the P-38 was a magnificent machine. They began taking off at exactly 7:25 a.m. 2 aircraft immediately aborted. Lieutenant McClanahan's tire went flat during takeoff. Lieutenant Moore's drop tanks wouldn't feed fuel to the engines. The spare aircraft moved up to fill the gaps. Now they were 16. Barber eased his throttles forward and the Lightning accelerated down the runway. The tail came up, the nose wheel lifted. Then the mains, and he was airborne. The green jungle of Guadalcanal fell away below. Ahead lay only ocean. Mitchell led them out over the water and immediately dropped to wave-top altitude. 50 feet, sometimes less. The reasoning was simple. Japanese radar on the Solomon Islands could detect high-flying aircraft. Down here, skimming the waves, they were invisible. But flying this low for over 2 hours required intense concentration. One moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation, and a pilot would cartwheel into the Pacific at 300 miles per hour. There would be no ejection, no bailout, no rescue, just instant death. The formation spread out in a long line, following Mitchell's lead. The drop tanks carried an additional 310 gallons of fuel, extending their range to the barely adequate level needed for this mission. Even with the external tanks, they would return to Guadalcanal with fuel tanks reading near empty. Any combat over the target area had to be brief, 10 minutes maximum. Then they had to run for home. Fighting longer meant running out of fuel over open ocean. Inside his cockpit, Barber settled into the grueling routine of low-altitude flight. Watch the waves, monitor engine instruments, keep formation. The sun climbed higher, turning the ocean into a mirror of reflected light. The temperature inside the greenhouse-style canopy climbed steadily. Sweat soaked through flight suits. There was no conversation. Radio silence was absolute. The mission depended on surprise. If the Japanese detected them coming, Yamamoto's flight would be diverted. All this effort for nothing. The minutes ticked by. Mitchell had calculated 5 separate legs of the flight, each with a different heading to account for wind drift and to skirt around Japanese-held islands. His navigation had to be flawless. No landmarks, no confirmation, just trust in mathematics and piloting skill. The other pilots followed, putting complete faith in Mitchell's ability to find a single flight of Japanese aircraft in the immense Pacific sky at a precise moment in time. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had left Rabaul exactly on schedule at 8:10 a.m. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers carried him and his staff. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters provided escort. The formation climbed to 6,500 feet and set course for Balal, near Bougainville. Yamamoto sat in the lead bomber, dressed in the olive-green uniform of the Japanese army, a detail meant to confuse any observers about his identity. His white-gloved hand rested on his samurai sword. The flight should take just over an hour. A routine inspection tour. Nothing unusual. He'd made similar flights before. Yamamoto had opposed the war with America from the beginning. He had spent years in the United States, studying at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, touring oil fields, learning about American industry and culture. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had learned to play poker, and had learned it well, winning consistently against American naval officers. Some said his poker victories had given him contempt for American military thinking. Others said he simply understood probability better than his opponents. He understood America's industrial capacity. He had seen the factories, the resources, the vast productive potential. When Japan's military leadership decided on war, Yamamoto knew the truth. Japan could not win a protracted conflict. The industrial might of America would eventually crush them. His only hope was a devastating surprise attack followed by rapid expansion, securing resources, creating a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to breach. Then perhaps negotiation, perhaps terms, perhaps survival. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been his plan, a carrier-based aerial assault on the American Pacific Fleet while it lay at anchor. The concept came from studying the British raid on Taranto in November 1940, where carrier aircraft had torpedoed Italian battleships in shallow harbour waters. Yamamoto adapted the tactics, developed specialised torpedoes, planned the operation with meticulous detail. The attack achieved complete surprise. American battleships burned, but the American carriers had been at sea. The repair facilities survived. The oil storage tanks remained intact. The attack had been a tactical success, but not the strategic knockout blow Yamamoto needed. Then came Midway, his plan to lure American carriers into a trap and destroy them. But American codebreakers had read his signals. The Americans knew he was coming. The battle became a disaster. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Japan's naval aviation decimated. The balance of power shifted. Now, less than a year later, Japan was retreating in the Solomons. The Guadalcanal campaign had failed. American forces were pushing forward. The war Yamamoto had feared was unfolding exactly as he had predicted. Japan was losing. This inspection tour was meant to boost morale, visit frontline units, show the troops their commander still believed in victory. Yamamoto sat in the bomber, his face expressionless as always. His staff officers occupied seats around him. In the second Betty bomber, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki and other staff members followed. The Zero escorts flew in 2 V formations, vigilant but not expecting trouble. Not here. Not now. At 9:33 a.m., Mitchell's formation approached the southern coast of Bougainville. The timing was perfect. 2 hours and 8 minutes of flight across open ocean with nothing but Mitchell's navigation to guide them, and they had arrived within 60 seconds of the planned intercept time. The other pilots could hardly believe it. Lieutenant Douglas Canning, flying top cover, first spotted the Japanese formation. He made a brief subdued radio call. Bogies, the P-38s jettisoned their external fuel tanks. The tanks tumbled into the jungle below, suddenly useless weight that had to go. Throttles went to full power. The Allison engines screamed. The 4-plane killer flight turned toward the Japanese bombers, now visible as dots descending toward their landing strip. The 12 top-cover aircraft climbed hard, preparing to deal with the Zero escorts. The Japanese pilots were stunned. Where had these American fighters come from? The escort Zeros dropped their own tanks and turned to engage. But the P-38s had surprise, position, and speed. Lanphier and Barber split, each choosing a different approach. Lanphier turned hard to engage the Zeros head-on, trying to keep them off Barber. Barber went straight for the bombers. The Betty bombers were large, twin-engine aircraft designed for long-range operations. They carried substantial fuel loads but lacked armor protection. Pilots called them flying lighters because they ignited so easily when hit. The lead Betty, carrying Yamamoto, suddenly tried to run. The pilot opened his throttles and dove toward the jungle, trying to reach the trees, trying to survive. Barber closed in from behind and opened fire. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon all fired simultaneously. The combined stream of bullets and shells walked up the right side of the Betty bomber. The right engine exploded into smoke and flame. Metal tore. The bomber shuddered under the impact. Still Barber fired, pouring rounds into the aircraft. Pieces flew off. The right wing root where it attached to the fuselage took multiple hits. The Betty rolled suddenly to the right and plunged into the jungle below, disappearing into the green canopy. The crash site would be found the next day. Yamamoto's body still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage, one hand still on his sword. The autopsy would find 2 50 caliber bullets had killed him. One entering from behind and exiting through his lower jaw, the other striking him in the shoulder. He had died before the crash. The second Betty, carrying Ugaki and the staff officers, became the next target. Holmes attacked from behind. The bomber tried to escape, diving for the water. The pilot fought to control his aircraft as machine gun fire tore through the fuselage. The Betty hit the ocean at full speed and broke apart. Water rushed in. Ugaki found himself underwater in total darkness. Then he was floating on the surface. 3 others from his bomber survived. The rest were dead. The tail section bearing the aircraft's identification number would remain visible, a marker of this moment. The entire engagement lasted minutes. The Zero escorts tangled with the top cover. Barber's P-38 took 104 hits from Zero fire but kept flying. 1 P-38 didn't make it home. Lieutenant Raymond Hines' aircraft disappeared. Japanese records would later identify pilot Shoichi Sugita as the Zero pilot who shot him down. Hine became the only American casualty of Operation Vengeance. His P-38 went into the ocean and his body was never recovered. The surviving P-38s broke off and headed for home. Holmes was so low on fuel he had to land in the Russell Islands. The others made it back to Guadalcanal. fuel gauges showing almost empty. As they approached Henderson Field for landing, Lanphier broke radio silence. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." The mission was complete. The P-38 Lightning had proven itself the perfect weapon for this mission. Only the Lightning had the range. Only the Lightning had the speed. Only the Lightning combined the endurance needed to reach the target with the firepower to ensure the kill. The twin-boom design, once considered radical and risky, had delivered a strategic victory of immense proportion. The aircraft's development had not been smooth. Early P-38s suffered from tail flutter at high speeds, a dangerous condition where the tail assembly would shake violently during high-speed dives. Test pilot Ralph Verdon died in November 1941 when his aircraft's tail failed during a high-speed recovery test. Lockheed engineers worked frantically to solve the problem. They discovered the issue was related to compressibility effects as the aircraft approached the speed of sound. The center of pressure moved backward at high speed, causing uncontrollable pitch down. The solution was dive flaps that extended from the wings to change the pressure distribution. It worked. The P-38 became not just flyable, but excellent at high-speed operations. The Lightning's combat record would become legendary. It shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter in the Pacific. P-38 pilots included two of the top American aces of the war. Major Richard Bong scored 40 kills, all in the P-38. Major Thomas Maguire scored 38 kills, also all in the Lightning. 7 of the top 10 American aces in the Pacific flew P-38s. The aircraft's combination of range, firepower, and twin-engine reliability made it ideal for the vast distances and over-water operations of the Pacific theater. In Europe, the P-38 had a more mixed record. The high-altitude cold caused problems with engine controls and cockpit heating. Pilots suffered frostbite. Engine failures became more common in the extreme cold of high-altitude European operations. The aircraft's large size made it less maneuverable than German fighters in tight dogfights. But in the Mediterranean theater, flying at lower altitudes in warmer conditions, the P-38 excelled. It flew ground attack missions, bomber escort, photo reconnaissance, and fighter sweeps. On April 5, 1943, 26 P-38s of the 82nd Fighter Group claimed 31 German aircraft destroyed in a single mission. It was during the North African campaign that reports emerged of German forces calling the aircraft der Gabelschwanz Teufel, though historians debate whether this nickname was genuine or Allied propaganda. The P-38's recognition profile was unmistakable. No other fighter looked like it. That distinctive twin-boom configuration could be identified instantly, even at long range. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear the silhouette. When P-38s appeared, combat became deadly serious. The Lightning pilots were usually experienced. Their aircraft could absorb damage and keep flying. Getting into a turning fight with a P-38 was dangerous because while it wasn't as nimble as a Zero, it was faster, could dive away to escape, and carried overwhelming firepower. The 450 caliber machine guns each fired 850 rounds per minute. The 20mm cannon added another 650 rounds per minute of explosive shells. When a P-38 pilot opened fire at close range, the target was hammered by a stream of projectiles that could tear apart an aircraft in seconds. Japanese bombers, which lacked armor protection to save weight for fuel and bombs, were particularly vulnerable. A short burst from a P-38 could set them ablaze or tear off critical control surfaces. The mission to kill Yamamoto had required special modifications. The standard P-38G carried 2 150-gallon drop tanks under the wings. For Operation Vengeance, a limited supply of 3 10-gallon tanks was flown up from New Guinea. Each aircraft carried 1 large tank and 1 small tank, creating an asymmetric weight distribution but extending range enough to make the mission possible. The difference was about 1,000 pounds more weight on one side, but the tanks were close enough to the aircraft's center of gravity that handling remained acceptable. The credit controversy began immediately after the mission. The military quickly credited Lanphier with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber. His after-action report claimed he had engaged the escort Zeros, shot one down by blowing off its wings, then reversed course and caught the lead bomber in a climbing turn. He said he fired and blew off the bomber's right wing, sending it into the jungle. Barber's account was different. He said he attacked the lead bomber from behind, hit it repeatedly until the right engine caught fire, then the bomber crashed. He also attacked the second bomber. Lanphier claimed to have seen Barber shoot down a different bomber. The problem was that only one bomber had crashed on Bougainville. The second had gone into the ocean. If both pilots claimed to have shot down bombers that crashed on land, something was wrong with one of the accounts. The pilots were not formally debriefed because no proper interrogation procedures existed on Guadalcanal at that time. The stories became fixed, and a controversy was born that would last decades. Over the years, evidence accumulated supporting Barber's version. Japanese Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had escorted Yamamoto's formation and survived the battle, told American investigators that he saw Yamamoto's Betty shot from behind and crash 20 to 30 seconds after being hit. The autopsy of Yamamoto's body showed he had been shot from behind, with bullets entering from the rear. Analysis of the crash site showed the pattern of bullet impacts came from behind and to the right, consistent with Barber's described attack angle, but not with Lanfear's claim of a side attack. In 1985, the Air Force convened a panel to review the evidence. They recommended that credit remain shared between Lanfear and Barber. In 1991, Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice upheld that decision. Barber appealed to federal court, but the court declined to intervene. The official record stands: both pilots receive half credit for destroying Yamamoto's aircraft. But historians examining the evidence have largely concluded that Barber deserves sole credit for the kill. Daniel Hallman, who served on the 1985 Air Force panel, stated in 2024 that after reviewing new evidence, he had become convinced that credit should go to Rex Barber alone. The controversy illustrates something deeper about combat. Events happen in seconds. Pilots are focused on survival, on flying, on shooting. Multiple aircraft are maneuvering violently in 3 dimensions. Adrenaline distorts perception and memory. What seems clear to one participant looks completely different to another. Both may be honestly reporting what they believe they experienced. Combat creates confusion. Sorting out the truth requires physical evidence, which is often scattered across miles of jungle or ocean floor. What cannot be disputed is the strategic impact of the mission. Yamamoto's death was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and leadership. He was irreplaceable. His understanding of naval aviation, his strategic vision, his ability to inspire confidence in difficult circumstances, all gone in an instant. His successors, Admiral Menechi Koga and later Admiral Soemu Toyoda, could not fill the void. They lacked Yamamoto's insight and authority. The Japanese Navy never again achieved the level of coordination and effectiveness it had under Yamamoto's leadership. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. If Yamamoto, the most protected and revered commander, could be killed by American aircraft, then no one was safe. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already shattered at Midway, took another devastating hit. American forces meanwhile celebrated. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. Justice had been served. The mission proved American intelligence could penetrate Japanese codes. It proved American aircraft could strike anywhere. It demonstrated capability and will. The decision to kill Yamamoto had not been made lightly. There were risks. If the Japanese realized their codes were compromised, they would change them. The entire American intelligence advantage could evaporate. To protect the source of the intelligence, a cover story was prepared. Australian coast watchers, the story went, had spotted a high-ranking Japanese officer boarding an aircraft at Rabaul. The Americans had simply gotten lucky with a long-range patrol. The Japanese eventually changed their codes anyway, but by then the damage was done. There was also the question of assassination. Was it legal to target a specific individual? Was this warfare or murder? Military lawyers reviewed the question. Yamamoto was a uniformed military commander traveling to an active combat zone during wartime. He was a legitimate military target. There was no violation of the laws of war. The mission would proceed. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance received the Navy Cross, America's second highest decoration for valor. Major Mitchell, who had been nominated for the Medal of Honor, was downgraded to the Navy Cross after the mission details leaked to the press. In October 1943, Time magazine published an article about the operation and named Lanfear. The Navy considered this a serious security breach. Mitchell's medal was reduced as a result. All the killer flight pilots received the same award. Mitchell, Lanfear, Barber and Holmes wore their Navy crosses proudly. Raymond Hine received his posthumously. The mission had been the longest fighter interception of the war. Over 435 miles to the target area, precise navigation across open ocean, perfect timing, successful combat engagement, and return flight while critically low on fuel. Every element had to work. Any single failure would have doomed the mission. Mitchell's navigation was flawless. The P-38s performed perfectly despite the extreme demands. The pilots executed with precision, and Admiral Yamamoto's rigid adherence to schedule had made him vulnerable. The P-38 continued serving until the end of the war. More than 10,000 were built in 18 different models. The aircraft flew more than 130,000 missions. It served in every theatre of the war. It performed as a fighter, bomber, reconnaissance aircraft and night fighter. The F-5 photo reconnaissance variant obtained 90% of the aerial film captured over Europe. The aircraft proved adaptable to almost any role. By late 1944, the P-38 was being supplemented and replaced by newer fighters in many roles. The P-51 Mustang had better high-altitude performance in Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt had better dive characteristics and was tougher in combat. But in the Pacific, the P-38 remained valuable until the end. Its range, twin-engine reliability, and heavy armament suited Pacific operations perfectly. When the war ended, P-38 pilot First Lieutenant Roy Wilson landed at Niigata, Japan on August 15, 1945. His wingman was low on fuel, so they landed. Wilson's P-38 was the first American aircraft to land in Japan after the surrender. The men who flew the Lightning remembered it with respect and affection. Yes, it was a handful at times. The controls were heavy. The cockpit could get hot. The engines required careful management. But it would bring you home. It would fight. It gave you a chance. In the desperate early days of the Pacific War, when American forces were outmatched and retreating, the P-38 arrived and began turning the tide. It gave American pilots an aircraft that could compete with and beat the best Japan could field. Colonel Ben Kelsey, one of the original P-38 test pilots, summed it up years later. That comfortable old cluck would fly like hell, fight like a wasp upstairs, and land like a butterfly. It was a pilot's assessment of a pilot's aircraft. Not perfect, but when it mattered, when everything was on the line, the P-38 delivered. Operation Vengeance represents a unique moment where intelligence, technology, and skill converged to change the course of a war. The codebreakers who intercepted and decrypted the Japanese message, the intelligence analysts who recognized its significance, the commanders who approved the mission despite the risks, the engineers who designed an aircraft capable of executing such a mission, the maintenance crews who kept those aircraft flying under brutal tropical conditions, the pilots who flew across hundreds of miles of open ocean, found their target, completed the mission, and came home. The story raises questions about the nature of warfare and leadership. What happens when a single individual becomes so central to a nation's war effort that killing him becomes a strategic priority? Yamamoto was brilliant. He was dedicated to his country. He had opposed the war he ended up leading. He understood Japan's fundamental weakness against American industrial power. Yet he fought effectively within the constraints he faced. His death changed the trajectory of the Pacific War, but perhaps only accelerated an outcome that was already determined by larger forces of production, resources, and national will. The P-38 Lightning became a symbol of American innovation and industrial capability. It represented the ability to conceive, design, build, and deploy advanced technology at scale. Lockheed, a relatively small company in 1937, created an aircraft that defied conventional design wisdom. Twin engines, twin booms, central nacelle. It looked wrong to many observers, but it worked. And when mass production began, American industry proved capable of building thousands of these complex machines with consistent quality. The pilots who flew these aircraft came from every part of America. Farm boys and city kids, college graduates and high school dropouts. They learned to fly, learned to fight, learned to survive. Many didn't. But those who did became part of an elite cadre of combat aviators who helped win the war. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, given powerful tools, and told to accomplish impossible missions. Rex Barber survived the war. He continued flying combat missions after Operation Vengeance, shooting down more Japanese aircraft. He returned home to Oregon, married, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. He never stopped believing he had shot down Yamamoto's bomber. The controversy bothered him, but he carried on with dignity. He died in 2001 at age 84. Thomas Lanphier also survived the war and maintained his claim until his death in 1987. The two men never reconciled their accounts. Major John Mitchell, who navigated across hundreds of miles of ocean to arrive at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, continued serving in the Air Force, His incredible feat of navigation made the entire mission possible. Without his skill, the 18 P-38s would have found only empty sky. He received less public recognition than the shoot-down controversy generated for Lanfear and Barber. But among aviation professionals, Mitchell's achievement was recognized as extraordinary. The P-38 Lightning faded from service after the war. Jets were coming. The age of propeller-driven fighters was ending. Most P-38s were scrapped. A few survive today in museums and private collections, meticulously restored to flying condition. When one appears at an air show, the distinctive sound of twin Allison engines brings spectators to their feet. The sight of that twin-boom configuration banking across the sky evokes an era when the outcome of civilization itself hung in the balance. April 18, 1943, demonstrated that technology, intelligence, and human courage could combine to achieve outcomes that seemed impossible. A year to the day after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American forces struck back in a different way, not with bombs on cities, but with precision elimination of enemy leadership. The mission required everything to work perfectly. The code breaking, the intelligence analysis, the command decision, the aircraft design, the logistics of supplying specialized fuel tanks, the navigation, the flying skill, the marksmanship, all of it. War is often described as chaos, and it is. But occasionally, through that chaos, moments of perfect clarity emerge, a plan that works exactly as designed, a mission that achieves its objective, a technology that proves its worth. Operation Vengeance was such a moment. From the intercept of a radio message to the crash of a bomber in the jungle of Bougainville, every piece fell into place. The intelligence operation that made the mission possible deserves deeper examination. Station Hypo in Hawaii, the Navy's code-breaking center, had been working on Japanese naval codes since before the war. The JN-25 series of codes were complex, constantly updated, and challenging to break. But American cryptanalysts, including future Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, had developed techniques for analyzing patterns, frequencies, and context. When the message about Yamamoto's inspection tour came through on April 14, 1943, multiple stations intercepted it simultaneously. Stations in Hawaii, Alaska, Australia, and Washington all picked up the transmission. The message was repeated in an older Japanese Army code that was less secure, providing confirmation and additional details. The codebreakers worked quickly, producing a translated message that included precise times, locations, aircraft types, and the number of escorts. The level of detail was extraordinary. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6:00 a.m. Tokyo time, which was 8:00 a.m. local Solomon Islands time. He would arrive at Balal at 8:01 a.m. Tokyo time or 10:00 a.m. local. The flight would use 2 medium attack planes, the code for Betty bombers. 6 fighters would escort. Even the inspection schedule at each location was included. Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, brought the translated message to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz immediately grasped the opportunity. This was the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the architect of American humiliation. Nimitz forwarded the intelligence to Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, who presented it to President Roosevelt. The president's response, whether the exact words or not, was clear. Yamamoto must be killed. The political and strategic calculation was complex. Revealing that American codebreakers could read Japanese signals was a massive risk. If the Japanese changed their codes, the intelligence advantage would disappear. The Americans had benefited enormously from reading Japanese naval communications. At Midway, code-breaking had given Nimitz exact knowledge of Japanese plans, turning what could have been a disaster into a decisive American victory. Risking that advantage was not a decision made lightly, but the opportunity to eliminate Yamamoto was considered worth the risk. His strategic vision, operational skill, and symbolic importance made him irreplaceable. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces, received the order to plan and execute the interception. Halsey delegated to Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded air operations in the Solomons, and Mitcher turned to Major John Mitchell and the P-38 squadrons at Henderson Field. The planning phase was intense. Mitchell studied the intelligence repeatedly. The flight path from Rabaul to Balal was direct, about 315 miles. But American fighters couldn't fly direct from Guadalcanal to intercept. That route would take them over Japanese-held islands with radar and observation posts. Detection would mean mission failure. Instead, Mitchell plotted a circuitous route that swung far to the west over open ocean before turning in to make the intercept. The total distance was approximately 435 miles each way. With combat and maneuvering, the mission would push the P-38's range to its absolute limit. Fuel calculations became critical. The standard P-38G had a range of about 450 miles with internal tanks. Adding two 150-gallon drop tanks extended that to roughly 850 miles. But that assumed cruising speed and altitude for maximum efficiency. Mitchell knew they would be flying low, which burned more fuel. They would be flying in combat formation, not optimal cruise configuration. And they would need reserve fuel for combat maneuvering. The math was tight, very tight. The arrival of 310-gallon drop tanks from New Guinea solved the problem, barely. One large tank plus one small tank on each aircraft provided just enough fuel for the mission profile Mitchell had planned. But there would be no margin for error, no circling, no extended combat. Hit fast, break off, run for home. That was the only way the fuel would last. Selecting the pilots required careful consideration. Mitchell wanted the best, but he also needed pilots with experience in the P-38. The aircraft had quirks that demanded familiarity. The counter-rotating propellers meant that engine-out procedures were different than standard single-engine fighters. The wheel-type control column, instead of a stick, required different muscle memory. The aircraft's size and weight made it less forgiving of mistakes. New pilots in P-38s were dangerous to themselves. This mission needed veterans. The kill flight selection was particularly important. These 4 pilots would actually engage the bombers. They needed to be aggressive but disciplined, skilled but not reckless. Lamphere, Barber, McClanahan and Moore were chosen. When McClanahan's tire went flat and Moore's fuel system failed, Holmes and Hine moved up. The mission proceeded with the pilots available. The psychological preparation was minimal by necessity. The mission was classified at the highest level. Pilots couldn't discuss it outside the briefing room. They couldn't write about it in letters home. They couldn't tell their crew chiefs the real objective. The cover story was that Coast Watchers had spotted a high-ranking Japanese officer. The pilots were briefed on this cover story and told to maintain it. But everyone suspected the truth. The level of planning, the precision of the intelligence, the involvement of senior commanders, all pointed to something extraordinary. When they took off on the morning of April 18th, the pilots knew they were flying a mission that would be remembered, if they survived to remember it. The flight itself tested every pilot's endurance. 2 hours and 8 minutes at wave-top altitude, maintaining strict radio silence, following Mitchell's lead across featureless ocean. The concentration required was exhausting. Look away for a moment and you could fly into the water, lose formation, and you might never find your way back. Trust Mitchell's navigation, because there was no alternative. Inside the cockpits, conditions were brutal. The sun beating through the greenhouse-style canopies turned the aircraft into ovens. Flight suits were soaked with sweat. Muscles ached from maintaining formation. Eyes burned from scanning instruments and watching the waves. The monotony punctuated by moments of stark fear when a wave crest seemed too close or turbulence jolted the aircraft. But Mitchell's navigation was flawless. His 5-leg course, calculated by dead reckoning with only compass and airspeed and time, brought them to the exact intercept point within a minute of the planned time. After flying more than 400 miles, over ocean with no landmarks and no confirmation, they arrived precisely when and where Yamamoto's flight would be. The feat of navigation was extraordinary, perhaps more impressive than the actual combat that followed. The engagement itself happened in seconds. From Canning's initial bogey call to the crash of Yamamoto's bomber was perhaps 2 minutes. In that brief window, the entire mission succeeded or failed. Barber's approach from behind, his sustained fire into the Betty bomber, the catastrophic damage to the right engine and wing root, the bomber's sudden roll and plunge into the jungle, all happened in a compressed instant of violence. Japanese. Accounts from the surviving Zero pilots describe confusion and shock. The Americans appeared from nowhere. The Zeros tried to protect the bombers, but were hampered by having just dropped their own tanks. The P-38s were faster, had altitude advantage, and achieved complete surprise. By the time the Zero pilots understood what was happening, both Betty bombers were under attack and one was already going down. The second Betty's demise was almost as quick. Holmes attacked from behind, walking his fire through the fuselage and wing roots. The Betty pilot tried desperately to evade, diving for the ocean, but the damage was too severe. The bomber hit the water at high speed and disintegrated. The survivors, including Ugaki, were rescued later by Japanese search and rescue. But most aboard that bomber died on impact or drowned in the wreckage. The Zero escorts tried to exact revenge. They tangled with the top-cover P-38s and went after the killer flight. Barber's aircraft took heavy damage, 104 bullet and cannon shell hits, but the P-38's rugged construction saved him. The center nacelle absorbed hits that would have killed a pilot in a single-engine fighter. The twin booms took damage but maintained structural integrity. The controls remained responsive enough to fly home. Hein wasn't so fortunate. His P-38 took fatal damage and went into the ocean. The break-off and return flight required discipline. The temptation to celebrate, to chase fleeing Zeros, to press the attack, had to be resisted. Fuel was critical. Every minute spent maneuvering over Bougainville was fuel that wouldn't be available for the return flight. Mitchell ordered everyone to disengage and head home. Most complied immediately. Some lingered a moment longer than wise, ensuring the bombers were actually down. The flight back seemed longer than the approach. The adrenaline was wearing off. Fatigue set in. Pilots checked fuel gauges repeatedly, calculating whether they had enough. Holmes, realizing he was critically low, diverted to the Russell Islands and made an emergency landing. He would refuel there and return to Guadalcanal later. The others pressed on, nursing their engines, conserving every drop of fuel. As Henderson Field came into view, the relief was palpable. They had made it. The mission was complete. Barber's shot-up P-38 landed safely despite extensive damage. The other pilots landed, parked, shut down engines, and climbed out. Only then did the enormity of what they had accomplished begin to sink in. The debriefing was immediate but informal. Intelligence officers wanted details. What aircraft were shot down? Which pilot engaged which target? Were there other Japanese aircraft in the area? The pilots gave their accounts, which already showed discrepancies. Lanfear's report differed from Barber's. Both claimed to have shot down bombers that crashed on land. The intelligence officers noted the inconsistencies, but didn't resolve them. They would have plenty of time to argue about credit later. The immediate concern was security. The mission had to remain classified. The cover story about coast watchers had to be maintained. Pilots were warned not to discuss the mission. Letters home were censored. The after-action reports were marked top secret. For the moment, Operation Vengeance would remain unknown outside a small circle of senior commanders. But word leaked. Military organizations are full of people who talk. Within weeks, rumors spread about a long-range mission that had killed a high-ranking Japanese officer. By October 1943, Time magazine published an article about the mission, naming Lanfear and revealing details that should have remained classified. The Navy was furious. The security breach was considered serious enough that Major Mitchell's recommended. Medal of Honor was downgraded to the Navy Cross in punishment. The leak had consequences. Japan officially announced Yamamoto's death on May 21, 1943, more than a month after the mission. The delay allowed time to organize an elaborate state funeral and manage public reaction. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was awarded the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum, Japan's highest honor. His ashes were divided, with portions buried at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo and at his ancestral home in Nagaoka. The state funeral was attended by the emperor and the highest officials of government and military. The nation mourned. The reaction in America was celebration. The man who planned Pearl Harbor was dead. American forces had reached out across hundreds of miles and eliminated him with precision. The mission proved American capability, resolve, and technological superiority. Morale soared. The message to Japan was clear. America could strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone. No one was safe. The strategic impact took time to fully manifest. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese naval operations continued, but the quality of decision-making declined. Yamamoto's successors lacked his vision and authority. Koga and later Toyoda were competent but not brilliant. They could not inspire confidence the way Yamamoto had. They could not see the strategic picture with Yamamoto's clarity. And critically, they could not effectively advocate for naval aviation against the battleship-focused traditionalists, who still dominated parts of the Japanese naval establishment. The P-38's role in the mission cemented its reputation. Here was proof that the twin-boom design, initially considered radical and risky, delivered strategic capability no other fighter could match. The range, the endurance, the firepower, the reliability, all had come together perfectly. Lockheed's engineers had created something special, and Operation Vengeance proved it beyond doubt. The aircraft continued evolving. The P-38J model introduced improved engines with more power. Dive flaps became standard, solving the high-speed compressibility problems that had plagued earlier models. Cockpit heating improved for high-altitude operations. Underwing hardpoints allowed carrying bombs or rockets for ground attack. The later P-38L model incorporated all these improvements and became the definitive version of the Lightning. By war's end, more than 10,000 P-38s had rolled off production lines. Lockheed's Burbank facility and consolidated Vultee's Nashville plant worked around the clock to meet demand. The aircraft served in every theater. It performed every mission. It proved adaptable, reliable, and deadly. Pilots who learned to exploit its strengths became formidable opponents. Those who tried to fight it like a single-engine fighter often died. The P-38's legacy extends beyond its combat record. It represented American industrial and engineering capability at a critical moment. When the Army Air Corps issued specifications, in 1937 that seemed nearly impossible, Lockheed didn't just meet them. They exceeded them with an aircraft design so radical it looked like science fiction. Kelly Johnson, who would later design the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, cut his teeth on the P-38 project. The unconventional thinking required for the Lightning's twin-boom design presaged his later work on aircraft that pushed technological boundaries even further. The manufacturing challenges were substantial. The P-38 had more than 1,400 major components. Each aircraft required thousands of rivets, miles of wiring, complex hydraulic systems, dual turbochargers, intercoolers, and precisely engineered control linkages. Building them in quantity demanded innovations in manufacturing techniques and quality control. Lockheed developed assembly line methods specifically for the P-38, breaking the aircraft into major subassemblies that could be constructed in parallel before final integration. The logistics of supporting P-38 operations in the Pacific were equally challenging. Each aircraft required specialized tools, replacement parts, trained mechanics. The twin-engine configuration meant double the engine maintenance. The turbochargers required careful adjustment and frequent inspection. The complex cooling systems needed monitoring. Yet American military logistics, the unglamorous backbone of warfighting capability, kept the P-38s flying, despite operating thousands of miles from factories and supply depots. Consider the maintenance requirements for Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38s had to be in perfect mechanical condition simultaneously. Engines had to be running optimally. Fuel systems had to be leak-free. Hydraulic systems had to function flawlessly. Radios, despite being kept silent, had to be operational in case of emergency. Gun sights had to be accurately calibrated. Ammunition had to be properly loaded, with belts feeding smoothly. The 3 10-gallon drop tanks had to be installed correctly, with fuel lines properly connected and leak tested. All this happened at Henderson Field, a former Japanese airstrip on Guadalcanal that American forces had captured less than 8 months earlier. The facilities were primitive. The conditions were tropical, with heat, humidity, and rain that corroded metal and rotted fabric. Insects, disease, and mud were constant problems. Yet the ground crews kept the P-38s flying. They worked through the night before the mission, checking every system, verifying every connection, ensuring that when Mitchell led his formation off the runway, every aircraft was mechanically sound. One crew chief described the preparation. "We didn't know what the mission was. They didn't tell us. But we could tell it was something big. Officers were checking things they usually didn't check. They wanted guarantees nothing would fail. So we went over everything twice, then 3 times. We tested the drop tanks, checked the fuel flow, ran up the engines. We weren't going to have them turn back because of something we missed." That dedication, replicated across thousands of ground crew members throughout the Pacific, kept American air power functioning. The pilots got the glory. The ground crews got the satisfaction of seeing their aircraft return safely. It was an unequal trade, perhaps, but both were necessary. The aftermath of Operation Vengeance resonated through both militaries. For the Japanese, Yamamoto's death was traumatic. He had been the public face of Japan's naval success. His speeches, his presence at ceremonies, his reputation for brilliance had sustained morale through difficult times. Now he was gone, killed by American aircraft in a mission that demonstrated American reach and capability. The psychological impact cannot be quantified, but was undoubtedly substantial. Japanese naval strategy became more cautious, more defensive. The aggressive, risk-taking approach that Yamamoto had championed gave way to conservation of forces. Part of this reflected Japan's deteriorating situation. Resources were scarce. Trained pilots were becoming harder to replace. But part reflected the absence of Yamamoto's leadership. His successors lacked his authority to push for bold operations, even when circumstances seemed unfavorable. For American forces, the mission validated the integration of intelligence, planning, technology, and execution. The chain from codebreakers to combat pilots had worked perfectly. This encouraged further emphasis on intelligence gathering and analysis. If Yamamoto could be killed through intelligence-driven operations, other high-value targets might be vulnerable too. The concept of targeted elimination of enemy leaders, controversial then and controversial now, proved operationally feasible. The P-38's performance in the mission also influenced aircraft procurement decisions. Despite some problems in Europe, the Lightning was retained in production because of its proven capability in the Pacific. The twin-engine configuration, which had been questioned by some military planners, was vindicated. The aircraft's ability to bring pilots home despite battle damage became legendary among flyers. Stories circulated of P-38s returning to base with one engine out, hydraulics failing, chunks of wing missing, yet landing safely. That reliability made pilots willing to press attacks they might have avoided in less forgiving aircraft. The human stories behind the mission deserve continued remembrance. Rex Barber, who almost certainly fired the shots that killed Yamamoto, lived with the controversy for decades. He never sought glory. He simply wanted recognition for what he had done. The fact that he was denied sole credit troubled him, but he remained a professional, never descending into bitterness, even when others claimed his achievement. Thomas Lanphier, equally convinced of his own account, defended his version until his death. From his perspective, he had shot down Yamamoto. The confusion of combat, the multiple aircraft, the limited time to observe results, all contributed to his belief. Whether he was mistaken or deliberately dishonest remains debated. What's clear is that his account became fixed quickly, and he never wavered from it. John Mitchell, whose navigation made everything possible, remained humble about his achievement. Years later, asked about the mission, he would credit the ground crews, the intelligence analysts, the other pilots. His role, he insisted, was simply flying a course and keeping track of time. That massive understatement typified the man. Navigating across hundreds of miles of ocean to arrive within 60 seconds of schedule was extraordinary. But to Mitchell, it was just doing his job well. Raymond Hine, killed in action during the mission, left a young widow and no children. His sacrifice was recognized with posthumous decorations, but he never knew the mission succeeded. He never learned that his death contributed to eliminating the architect of Pearl Harbor. He was 23 years old, one of tens of thousands of young American servicemen who died in the Pacific War. Each death a tragedy, each loss felt by families back home. The Japanese escort pilots who survived told their own stories. They had been outmatched, outpositioned, unable to prevent the disaster they witnessed. The shame and guilt haunted some of them. They had failed to protect their commander. That failure would be remembered. In Japan's military culture, where duty and honor were paramount, the surviving escort pilots carried a burden that wasn't truly their fault. The Americans had achieved surprise, had better aircraft for the mission, had executed perfectly. But rationality didn't ease the psychological weight. The wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber remained in the jungle for decades. The tail section was recovered and now sits in museums as a silent testament to that moment. The crash site can still be visited, though it requires a trek through difficult terrain. The jungle has reclaimed much of it, vines and trees growing through and around the scattered debris. A memorial marks the location. Tourists and historians make the pilgrimage to stand where Yamamoto died. His body, recovered the day after the crash by Japanese search parties, showed the effects of Barber's marksmanship. 2 .50-caliber bullets had hit him. One entered from behind his left shoulder, exited through his lower jaw, killing him almost instantly. The second hit his left shoulder area. The autopsy reported that Yamamoto died from gunfire, not the crash. He was dead before the bomber hit the trees. Quick, perhaps painless, but final. The state funeral in Tokyo was magnificent and somber. The emperor attended, an almost unprecedented honor. Senior military and government officials filled the ceremonial space. The public lined streets to watch the procession. Yamamoto was celebrated as a hero, a brilliant strategist, a devoted servant of the empire. The fact that he had opposed the war with America was not mentioned. The fact that he had predicted Japan's defeat if the war dragged on was not emphasized. He was remembered as the victor of Pearl Harbor, the architect of Japan's early successes, the naval genius. In America, the reaction was more complicated. Yes, the man who planned Pearl Harbor was dead. Justice had been served. Revenge had been taken. But thoughtful observers recognized that Yamamoto had been a formidable opponent. His death didn't change Japan's ultimate defeat, which was assured by larger forces of industry and resources. But it did represent a significant tactical victory and a psychological blow to Japanese morale. The controversy over credit would drag on for generations. In 1985, an Air Force panel reviewed all available evidence and recommended shared credit for Lanphier and Barber. In 1991, that recommendation was formalized by the Secretary of the Air Force. Barber appealed, presenting new evidence and testimony. His appeal was denied. In 2003, after Barber's death, the Oregon State Legislature passed a resolution crediting him with the sole kill. The Air Force did not change its official record. Modern historians examining the evidence overwhelmingly conclude that Barber deserves sole credit. The physical evidence, the Japanese eyewitness accounts, the autopsy results, the analysis of attack angles and timing, all support Barber's version. Lanphier's account has logical inconsistencies and conflicts with objective evidence, but officially the record remains unchanged. Both pilots share credit. The truth, as is often the case in military history, has been obscured by incomplete documentation and conflicting accounts. What cannot be disputed is the mission's success. Yamamoto died. American forces proved their capability. The P-38 Lightning validated its design. The intelligence operation demonstrated American code-breaking prowess. The coordination between multiple commands and services worked flawlessly. From strategic conception to tactical execution, Operation Vengeance stands as an example of how modern warfare can achieve precise effects against specific targets, when intelligence, technology, and skill align. The broader implications for air power doctrine were significant. The mission demonstrated that aircraft could project power across vast distances with precision. This concept, which seems obvious today, was revolutionary in 1943. Strategic bombing was understood. Fighter combat was understood. But using fighters as long-range precision strike weapons against specific individuals was novel. The mission planted seeds that would grow into modern concepts of precision strike, leadership decapitation, and intelligence-driven targeting. The technological advances that made the mission possible continued developing after the war. The P-38's twin-engine, long-range fighter concept influenced subsequent designs. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, incorporated lessons learned from the P-38 program. Later aircraft, like the F-94 Starfire and F-14 Tomcat, continued the tradition of twin-engine fighters designed for long-range missions. The P-38's DNA can be traced through generations of American military aircraft. The intelligence operation that intercept Yamamoto's travel plans presaged the enormous emphasis on signals intelligence that would characterize the Cold War and beyond. The National Security Agency, created in 1952, inherited the institutional knowledge and techniques developed by wartime codebreakers. The lesson that breaking enemy communications could provide decisive strategic advantages became foundational to American intelligence practice. Every modern signals intelligence success traces its lineage back to operations like the Yamamoto intercept. The men who flew the mission went their separate ways after the war. Most returned to civilian life, carrying memories they often couldn't discuss because of classification restrictions. Some stayed in the newly formed Air Force, making careers of military aviation. A few became test pilots, pushing the boundaries of jet aircraft performance. Others simply went home, married, raised families, worked regular jobs, and rarely spoke of the day they killed Admiral Yamamoto. Their stories deserve telling not because they were uniquely heroic, though they were brave, but because they represent thousands of similar stories from the war. Young men trained for a few months, given complex machines, sent into combat, and expected to perform flawlessly under conditions of extreme stress. Most did, some didn't return. All were changed by the experience. The P-38 Lightning, meanwhile, faded into history as jet aircraft replaced propeller-driven fighters. The last operational P-38s were retired in the early 1950s, deemed obsolete by the advent of swept-wing jets that could fly faster and higher. Most were scrapped, the aluminum recycled, but a few survived in museums, private collections, and restoration projects. Today, perhaps 15 flyable P-38s remain worldwide. When one appears at an air show, crowds gather to see this distinctive aircraft from another era. The sound is unmistakable. The twin Allison engines produce a deep, rumbling growl, unlike any other aircraft. When a P-38 passes overhead, that sound evokes a time when the world hung in the balance, when young men flew impossible missions, when technology and courage combined to achieve what seemed impossible. For veterans who flew the Lightning, hearing that sound decades later brings tears. For younger generations, it's a tangible connection to history, a reminder that freedom was won through sacrifice and skill. The story of the P-38 Lightning and Operation Vengeance resonates because it combines technological innovation, strategic intelligence, tactical excellence, and individual heroism into a single narrative. The aircraft was remarkable. The mission was audacious. The execution was nearly perfect. And the result changed the course of the Pacific War in ways both tangible and psychological. Admiral Yamamoto, brilliant strategist and reluctant warrior, died doing his duty. He had opposed the war, but fought it as effectively as circumstances allowed. His death removed Japan's most capable naval commander at a moment when such leadership was desperately needed. Whether his survival would have significantly altered Japan's ultimate defeat remains debatable. The fundamental imbalance between American and Japanese industrial capacity made Japan's defeat virtually certain once America fully mobilized. But Yamamoto's loss accelerated Japanese decline and deprived the Imperial Navy of its most visionary leader. The P-38 pilots who intercepted Yamamoto's flight did not know they were making history. They were flying a mission, following orders, trying to survive. Only later did they understand that April 18, 1943 would be remembered. Only in retrospect could they see that their mission had struck a blow that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical success. The fork-tailed devil had lived up to its fearsome reputation. Japanese pilots who feared encountering P-38s had good reason. The aircraft was fast, powerful, deadly, and flown by increasingly skilled pilots. It could strike from long range, hit hard, and escape before effective response. On April 18, 1943, it reached across hundreds of miles of ocean to eliminate the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. Technology, intelligence, and human skill had converged to change history. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had feared awakening had struck back with precision and power. The lightning had struck. Admiral Yamamoto was dead, and the Pacific War had lost its most brilliant Japanese strategist, hastening an outcome that had become inevitable but was now undeniable. The mission was complete. The legend was born. The fork-tailed devil earned its name not through propaganda or exaggeration, but through performance in combat. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-38s remembered the experience, the speed, the firepower, the way it could absorb damage and keep fighting, the knowledge that its pilots were skilled and aggressive. In the vast theater of the Pacific War, where distances tested every limit of aircraft and crew, the Lightning proved itself again and again. The death of Yamamoto changed the war, but did not change its ultimate outcome. Japan was already losing. American industrial production was overwhelming Japanese capacity. The carriers were building. The bombers were rolling off production lines. The submarines were strangling Japanese shipping. The Marines and Army were island-hopping toward Japan itself. Yamamoto's death accelerated Japanese decline, but did not cause it. The fundamental imbalance of power made Japan's defeat inevitable once America fully mobilized its resources. But individual moments matter. Individual decisions matter. Individual people matter. Yamamoto mattered to Japan. His death mattered to Japanese morale and naval effectiveness. The mission to kill him mattered to American morale. And the aircraft that made the mission possible mattered to the history of aviation and warfare. Technology shapes history. The P-38 Lightning, with its radical twin-boom design and powerful engines, created capabilities that did not exist before. It could fly farther than other fighters. It could hit harder. It could bring pilots home when other aircraft would have failed. Those capabilities enabled specific missions, including Operation Vengeance. Without the P-38, the mission would not have been attempted. Without the mission, Yamamoto would have continued leading Japan's navy. History would have unfolded differently in small but real ways. The men who designed the P-38 did not know it would be used to kill Yamamoto. The engineers at Lockheed were solving technical problems, meeting specifications, trying to create an effective fighter aircraft. The pilots who flew it on April 18, 1943, were following orders, executing a mission, trying to survive. Nobody knew in the moment that this particular mission would become legendary, that it would be studied decades later, that arguments about credit for the shootdown would continue long after the war ended. History is made by people who don't know they're making history. They're just doing their jobs, flying their aircraft, following their training, making split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. Only later does the significance become clear. Only in retrospect can we see the threads connecting codebreakers in Hawaii to engineers in California, to pilots over the Solomon Islands, to the death of an admiral in the jungle. The P-38 Lightning flew on for nearly 2 more years after Operation Vengeance. It fought in countless battles. It escorted bombers deep into enemy territory. It flew reconnaissance missions, photographing targets for future strikes. It ground-attacked enemy positions. It swept for enemy fighters. It served. And in serving, it wrote itself into the history of American military aviation as one of the truly distinctive aircraft of the war. When the last mission was flown, when the last P-38 was retired from combat, the veterans remembered. They remembered the sound of those twin engines, the feel of the controls, the sight of tracers reaching out toward an enemy aircraft, the relief of landing safely after a mission, the friends who didn't come back. The P-38 had carried them through the war. For many, it had saved their lives. They would remember it forever. In the end, the story of the P-38 Lightning and Operation Vengeance is a story about convergence. Technology converging with intelligence, capability converging with opportunity, courage converging with necessity. And at a precise moment in April 1943, over the island of Bougainville, all those elements converged to eliminate the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. The fork-tailed devil lived up to its name. Japanese pilots had feared it. On April 18th, their greatest commander learned why.